Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I'm honored to be the first speaker in this George Beal lecture series. I have a couple of personal notes in addition. This talk was originally scheduled for last spring, and I couldn't come because of a death in the family. I want to thank the department for its consideration, thoughtfulness at the time. I have another personal comment, which is as I am speaking, my San Francisco Giants are playing a wild card game. Don't anybody tell me what the score is during the lecture. Okay, it'll be too distracting. When I got this invitation to do the Beal lecture, I thought at first it was sort of odd for me to do a lecture in honor of a great rural sociologist. As someone who was raised in the New York metropolitan area and lives in the San Francisco metropolitan area, most of what I know about farms has to do with taking my kids to the petting zoo. But upon reflection, I felt that there were some points of intellectual convergence with the work of Beal and other rural sociologists, especially here at Iowa State. For one, much of my early work, as was mentioned, had to do with the social psychology of urban life, which involves studying the poles, the two ends of community life, urban and rural. And it's due to decades of work by scholars such as Beal and others at Iowa State that we understand a lot about the rural side of that urban-rural continuum. Also, a lot of my work, in one way or another, has involved applying the diffusion of innovation model that was alluded to in Don Dillman's comments. This is a theoretical apparatus, a way of thinking about social change that is very powerful, and everyone is indebted to much of the work that was done by Beal and others and elaborated right here at Iowa State in the 1950s. I can't exaggerate how important this conceptual apparatus has been for understanding social change. And a third intellectual connection, my more recent work in the last quarter century or so, has been on American social history. And there I am indebted to historians, of course, who have written a lot about rural America, but I'm also indebted to rural sociologists of the mid-20th century who provided studies of that day and that time, which is, of course, now history. For many of my students, the middle of the 20th century might as well be the Roman Empire. But those were important studies which help us understand the nature of change in America over that period. So that's the background. Here, let me tell you what I'll talk about in the time I have. First, I'm going to sketch an argument about what I think has made American culture distinctive, has made the American character. And in doing so, I will next go on to talk about the key role of the rural Midwest with some examples from Iowa. The key role of the rural Midwest in creating that distinctive American culture. One is the contribution to the creation of economic security, which is fundamental. And another is the way in which the life of the rural Midwestern lifestyle has come to exemplify and did exemplify the sort of key features, some of the key features of what is distinctively American culture and character. In doing so, by the way, I'll take particular note of the role of farm women who played an important part in this story. And time willing, I will look at some of the sort of present issues and crises that I can see from a distance, from California, that I could see in rural America. So, let me begin by giving you a sketch of the argument I make in my book, 2010 book, Made in America. What I try to do in that book is to summarize the social history of the United States. Probably an overly arrogant goal. By social history, I mean not the history of wars and presidents and famous men and so forth, but the history of how ordinary people lived their ordinary lives and how that changed over the course of American history. And it focuses a lot on the economic bases of people's ordinary lives, the nature of Americans' personal relationships, and it concludes with a discussion of what I call mentality, sort of what's the basic character and psychology of American life and how has that changed over the last 250 years. Now, the argument I make in the book, the theoretical argument, is that from the very start, America has had a distinct cultural character, a cultural character that separated it from the old world. That character entailed what I labeled, others have labeled as well, voluntarism. Let me explain what I mean by voluntarism. I do not mean volunteerism, as in joining clubs and handing out meals on Thanksgiving, although volunteering is part of the story. Voluntarism is a broader concept. First, we start with the notion that America and Americans are, by world standards and by historical standards, unusually individualistic. Let's just take that, stipulate that. It's quite clear to be true. And they've been described, Americans have been described for generations as being individualistic. One of the interesting things for me is that at the same time, Americans have been and been described very much as joiners and builders of community. Back to Tocqueville, when he talked about the importance of associational life in America and beyond. So the concept of voluntarism describes the American combination of individualism on the one hand and community on the other. Now that seems to be a paradox. These seem to be opposites, individualism and community. How can Americans be both? And the argument I make is the way Americans have been both, and American culture has been both, is to stress that community is voluntary. To stress the importance of voluntary community, of choosing, each individual choosing his or her community. That is, Americans have historically seen themselves as free to join and as free to leave communities that they have built voluntarily. I won't take the time, but just point out that this is in contrast to the way most people have lived their lives in most places in the world for most of human history, in which you were a part of a community by birth, and you were stuck with it, and that was it, beginning, end, and middle. The distinction here, I argue, is that voluntarism, this combination of individualism and voluntary chosen communities, is what is very distinctive about American culture. Moreover, I argue that over the course of American history, that distinctive voluntaristic culture, that emphasis on individual choice of community, has intensified, and it has spread. It has spread in the following sense. More and more Americans have been empowered to act in this voluntaristic way. All sorts of groups of people, Americans, who in the 18th century and 19th century were really outside of this sphere because they were dependents, not independent, have become increasingly participants in this mainstream voluntarist community. Notably, the category of women, but also including youth, minorities, and the poor, have increasingly become full participants in this American culture. That is, instead of being dependents in households ruled by a male patriarch, which is the 18th century model, the only independent people in 18th century America were property-holding white men. That group has expanded to include far more of the population. So in that sense, America's voluntaristic culture has expanded. So that's in a nutshell the argument I make about the nature of American character and the historical development of that character and culture. Now, in this talk, I'm going to make two specific connections between this story that I just summarized in a nutshell for you and the history of the rural Midwest. I'm going to stress two things. One is the importance of this region in establishing the economic security necessary for the development of American voluntarism. And secondly, the ways in which, as I mentioned before, the lifestyle common to the rural Midwest epitomized, demonstrated, exemplified this voluntaristic community. Along the way, I'll also draw on an earlier book of mine that was mentioned, a book on the social history of the telephone, in which Iowa also plays an important role. First, the role of rural Iowa and the region in providing economic security. The argument is that this expansion of voluntarism, the ability of more and more people to choose the communities within which they would live, depended on increasing economic security over the last 2 centuries. This economic security is a prerequisite for this kind of participation in this voluntaristic culture. For more Americans to live out the voluntaristic life requires the autonomy and ability to make choices of community And that depends on having greater and wider levels of economic security. That security, economic security, I also talk some about physical security, just the security of being free from physical assault and such. But the economic security, in turn, was made possible by at least three things. One is booming industrialization, the Industrial Revolution and all that brings with it. Secondly, the expansion of government-based security systems. The development of strong government in terms of law and order, courts to enforce contracts, all the way to things like building sewage plants, unemployment insurance, etc., was another key way in which economic security was made possible in America. And then critically, and perhaps primarily, the agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution that made food cheap and raised American health and standards of living. When I talk about the agricultural revolution, I'm including the development of production for national and worldwide markets, technical improvements in everything from the machinery of farming to seeds to preservation of crops and so forth. I'm talking about, in some ways, the industrialization of agriculture, specialization, mechanization, refrigeration, transportation, regulation, government subsidies, etc. One might say that I'm talking about all the things that today's food activists hate about farming and agriculture. But these are the things that made food cheap and available, healthy, nutritious food available to the wider American population. And the rural Midwest was where that really happened. It's not where it started, but it's where it really took off. Now, the creation of food abundance in the United States in the 19th century was not an even or a smooth process. There is evidence, for example, that in the middle of the 19th century, Americans suffered a reduction in their health and their nutrition. There's evidence based on how tall Americans were and illness rates and death rates that somewhere in the middle of the century, things actually got worse. And one explanation for that lower nutrition was the diversion of crops from subsistence, that is farmers feeding themselves, to selling on the market, and monocultures and so forth. But in the long run, by the end of the 19th century, by the beginning of the 20th century, the agricultural revolution had made a huge difference in Americans' lives. It made a huge difference in health and mortality. That's quite clear. Along with the development of public health measures, the availability of year-round of nutritious food was a critical factor in extending the lifespan and the health of Americans. And it made a huge difference economically and in terms of economic security. Even as late as 1900, Americans spent about half of their money buying food. By the end of the century, by 2000, it was down to about 14%, from 50 to about 14%. Food had become relatively a cheap thing to get by our time, when it had been a very expensive part of people's budgets originally. It also meant that the availability of good, nutritious, cheap food freed up income for other things that Americans did. Buying homes, recreation, and very critically, home ownership. But the key, of course, as I say, was a massive food production coming out of the American Midwest. Now, that massive food production, in turn, required adopting all sorts of innovations. Innovations that emerged on the farm. Innovations that emerged, many of them, from the land-grant colleges, of which Iowa State was one of the forefront. The extension services that were provided, especially in the 20th century, of innovations, guidance, training, and so forth in farming. How those innovations developed, how they were spread, how they were successful, were the kinds of things that rural sociologists at places like Iowa State studied. The development and the diffusion of new seeds, farming methods, marketing methods, and so forth. Now, I've written in particular about two parts of the innovation story, the technical innovation story, that testify to the importance of farmers, Midwestern farmers, in the story of technical innovation. One, as I alluded to before, is on the telephone, and the other is on the automobile. So let me talk a little bit about the telephone. In fact, Don Dillman asked me if I was going to talk about the telephone, so here you are. In the 19th century, when Alexander Graham Bell invented the phone and the phone started coming around in the 1880s, the telephone companies were, for various reasons, the Bell Company was, for various reasons, uninterested in farmers as consumers. It was very expensive to put lines out to farmers. They didn't have a lot of ready cash available to pay the fees. There was an assumption among urban city executives that farmers weren't interested and wouldn't even know how to use the phones. But in fact, farmers are very quick to establish their own telephone systems, their own cooperatives, and their own independence. Some of them, sometimes they did it before they could legally do it. That is, when the Bell patents said that you could not build your own telephone system. There were farmers around the country who were doing it anyway. And then when it became legal, when the patents of the Bell Company expired, there was this huge explosion of telephone development in rural America by farmers and by local village townsfolk who were businessmen who dealt with farmers. And farmers quickly became, in the early part of the 20th century, America's greatest residential phone subscribers. In the 1920s, Iowa led the nation in telephone subscriptions. And the key thing that explained that pattern was the existence of successful, independent landholding farmers. Where states had a large population like that, they tended to have a lot of telephones. And farmers were enthusiastic users and often creative users of the telephone. The dinner we had before, during the dinner we had before this talk, Don Dillman and others reminisced about the party lines on Iowa farm systems back in the day. To quote from my book on telephone history, the telephone companies, quote, considered farmers to be hard-headed, short-sighted, and tight-fisted. The companies clashed with rural subscribers over rates, maintenance, technical quality, the monopolizing of party lines for gossip, or even banjo playing. That was another thing. Sometimes people would play banjo and everybody on the party line would listen. Party lines for gossip or even banjo playing, chronic eavesdropping, and the like. Still, dealing with farmers seemed necessary, particularly in the era of heated competition when there were a lot of phone companies competing with each other. In 1903, a telephone executive complained that, quote, farmers as a class are troublesome customers to handle and are apt to have exaggerated idea of their own rights. There should certainly be some way of checking the senseless gossip that is carried to interminable lengths on some rural lines. The ambivalence of the phone companies is captured by one telephone manager's reassurance to his colleagues in 1910. Do not let anyone convince you that you cannot reason with the Iowa or Nebraska farmer. Do not be afraid of them. So farmers were, interestingly, innovators on the telephone, but in many other ways as well that helped contribute to this development of the farm industry. The automobile, similarly. I conducted less direct research on the automobile in rural America. Others have done that research. But I can say this about farmers and the telephone. The first automobiles that came to America were largely toys for the upper class. And in fact, again, automobile manufacturers really didn't imagine there was much of a demand for automobiles on America's farms. But in fact, rural farmers led the Ford Model T boom around the 1910s by finding practical applications for the car. One practical application, of course, was taking product to market. Another practical application was hitching up the back of the car, getting a belt, using the turning wheels as you ran the engine to turn some machinery on the farm. Again, one can say that Midwest farmers were quick to grasp the practicality of many of these innovations. Now, one aspect of the diffusion of these two technologies that I'll mention briefly here, and I'm going to get back to later, is the role of farm women. They were critical to these diffusions of technology. For instance, in the cases that I know of, the telephone and the automobile, by largely pushing their husbands to get the telephones and the automobile. And women, of course, were critical in I'll talk more about that later as well. Women were, of course, critical in making the economics of rural life work. One study of frontier Iowa in the mid-19th century pointed out that this was a historical era in which husband and wife on the farm were first and foremost economic partners. Marriage on the frontier was really first and foremost about the practicalities of coupling to survive on the farm. This stuff about love and romance, that comes later. And women's tasks on the farm included not only the usual domestic chores of cooking and canning and soap making and candle making and spinning and weaving, but also field work, weeding and picking and digging taters, gathering wild and domestic fruits, planting herb gardens, gathering wild herbs and eggs, and sometimes milking the cows. So to sum up the point I want to make here, the larger point, this kind of hard work multiplied by the new innovations in farming and the industry of agriculture, from railroads to new seeds, launched the great productivity, the agricultural productivity boom in America that in turn, by providing economic security to the wider American population, made that story, the growth of a voluntaristic culture, possible. And that economic security, as I said, was foundational to creating the modern culture, modern voluntaristic culture that we have. Okay, so that's one connection between rural Iowa and this story about the making of American culture. The distinctive American culture, this mix of individualism and community that makes what I call voluntarism, did not originate in the rural Midwest. It originated in New England. But it certainly found great expression here in the 19th and early 20th century. The model of the self-reliant American coming together with other self-reliant Americans in voluntary fellowship was rooted in that Protestant dissonant culture of New England in the 17th and 18th centuries. But it spread. It spread geographically across the continent and also spread across categories of people. To recap a point I made earlier, originally only white male heads of households with property were considered to be what it was called in the 18th century competent, to have competency, which meant to have the economic independence to be autonomous decision makers. So if you go back and you read some of that 18th century stuff about the founding of American democracy, the assumption was property was important because only free independent males who had property would be able to make up their own minds. Everybody else in the society, which is to say the vast majority of people in the society, were dependent on somebody else, either because they were poor, or they were female, or they were slaves, or they were servants, and of course could not be trusted to be democratic citizens because they wouldn't be independent. But that independence spread across other categories to just about everyone, every adult. More and more Americans gained that quote-unquote competency, again, notably women. Now, this voluntaristic culture came to the rural Midwest. And I shall argue women should get most of the credit for adding the community part to the individualism part that together makes the voluntarism. There's a great challenge to creating community in American rural life, especially as the New England frontier spread out into upper New York and then into the Midwest and so forth. The kind of dispersed living arrangements that rural Americans had, in which people lived on their own independent household, which are very unusual in world history. The rural Englishmen lived in packed villages and then would go out each day to farm their little plot of land. And that's the typical way of farming around the world and historically. But Americans were living on these separate households. That makes it hard to create community, unlike the old world. Also, rural America was culturally heterogeneous, not like the old world. All sorts of people were coming and living in the same vicinity of each other, which led to tensions and misunderstandings, which I'll mention again a little bit later on. How does one create a society out of scattered households, overwhelmingly believing in dissonant Protestant ideas of individualism, and often very heterogeneous? One of the key forms, I argue, is the development of the religious congregation. Again, in contrast to most old world forms of established hierarchical religious institutions, what America got was the congregational form of religion, in which a bunch of people who share a bunch of ideas about religion get together, pool their money together, hire a minister, and run a church like it was a club. And that was the sort of primal model of community in America, going back to the 17th century and 18th centuries. Worshippers coming together as their inclinations fit, free to join and free to leave. Free to join and free to leave their religious association. Other kinds of associations, clubs, townships, social movements, etc., were built on this model. Now, in rural America in particular, women were generally critical in the creation of the churches and in the wider community formulation. It was farm women who historically complained most about isolation and about lack of community in rural America. It's a recurrent theme in the history of rural America. For example, in the early part of the 20th century, there were several investigations out of Washington about what was called the country problem. And the country problem had to do with all sorts of issues in farm life. It had to do with poverty. It had to do with young people leaving the farm. It had to do with economic issues. But a common issue, particularly stressed by women, was a sense of isolation. In 1908, for example, nearly 100,000 farm residents were surveyed by the Teddy Roosevelt's Country Life Commission. And they overwhelmingly reported themselves as dissatisfied with their ability to, quote, get together for mutual improvement, entertainment, and social intercourse, end quote. A 1919 survey of 10,000 farm households found that, quote, the farm woman felt her isolation from neighbors, end quote, and wanted more contact with other women. Now, these are samples from the early 20th century, but this, I would argue, was a chronic problem in rural America, the isolation based on isolated households. And thus, farm women were critical in building community. A favorite source of mine on this story is a diary of a young woman called Keturah Belknap. Back in the 1840s, she ended up in Oregon, but she spent the decade of the 1840s when she was in her 20s in Iowa. And I'm just going to read a couple excerpts from her diary. Writing in June 1841, at the age of 21, she wrote in her diary about a forthcoming camp meeting and its social side. Quote, now that the corn is laid by, George and I are going to take a vacation and go about 10 miles away to a camp meeting, that is, revival. There are 4 young men and 2 girls going with us, but I made them promise there should be no sparking, and they should all be in their proper places in time of service, for they were all members of the church. If they did not set a good example before the world and show which side they were on, they could not go with me, and they behaved to the letter. In winter, Keturah Belknap's family hosted traveling preachers and services. So from her diary of January 1844, the meeting is over and the house cleaned up. We had a good time and the house was packed every night. Good sleighing and everybody seemed to be interested. The meeting lasted for 10 days. How about that for church service? The meeting lasted for 10 days, had over 20 conversions, and I thought that was about the best time I ever had. I cooked by the fireplace, and our one room served for the church, kitchen, dining room, bedroom, and study for the preacher. Sometimes we had 3 or 4 as they came by from adjoining circuits to help us through the work. Now, this excerpt from this diary, Iowa diary, gives us a sense of the purposeful, driven effort at congregation building, and therefore at community building, that farm women were engaged in. And as I suggested earlier in my talk, farm women were also central in developing new communications. I'm going to drill down to Iowa again. As part of my study in the history of the telephone, I analyzed an unusual telephone directory from Dubuque County, 1924. That directory allowed me to analyze which farms in the county in 1924 were likely to have telephones. And the answer was, still is, all else equal, the more adult women living in a household, the likelier to have a telephone. There's another study that showed that A study also of Iowa women, farm women, in the 1930s showed that they made 60% of the calls on farm telephones. And a similar trend shows up with regard to cars, getting back to that Dubuque County data. The more women in a household, the more likely they were to have a car. Another study done for Davenport showed that most rural mail, that is postal mail, was between women. The point of these pieces of data are to underline the strong role women had in providing the communications and building the communications that was part of building the community that was part of creating the voluntaristic society. Now, at the same time, this individualistic component of American culture was certainly strong and should not be underestimated. And here I draw on a study by a late colleague of mine of farmers in the upper Midwest, John Jurdy, a very good book called Minds of the West, about 19th century rural Midwest. Jurdy describes the culture clash between newly settled newly settled immigrants from Scandinavia and Germany and their neighbors who were Americans or quote-unquote Yankees, that is, who had come from other parts of the United States. So you have these immigrants from the old world and then these Americans from the East Coast moving in. The European immigrants carried with them a strong emphasis on the lineage, the family line, the household, the authority of the patriarch. And they were shocked, just shocked, by what the Yankees were doing, how permissive the Yankees were. For instance, they allowed their wives to avoid doing hard field work. The Yankees believed in love as a reason for getting married. The Yankees believed that children should be allowed to leave the farm and go to town for urban jobs. The Yankees believed it was okay to sell your farm just for the money. This confrontation between the old world and this American voluntaristic world was very stark here on the plains of the upper Midwest. So, to wrap up these points, I'm arguing that the rural Midwest was a key part of creating the economic security that made the growth of American voluntaristic culture possible, and that the rural Midwest was in many ways an exemplary case of this voluntaristic culture. The mingling of individualism, self-reliance, your own farm homestead, the sort of Protestant religious tradition on the one hand, and the creation of community, the voluntaristic creation of community, the building, the conscious effort to build communities which people voluntarily joined and voluntarily left. And let me underline this point about voluntarily left. In the American worldview, if things were changing for you, if you had a chance to move to better lands, if you had a chance to go try to strike it rich in the gold rush in California, and you said you were leaving, hey, that was cool. Everybody's free to come, everybody's free to go. You're not a traitor to leave. So the idea of this voluntaristic community is you're free to join whichever one you want, and you're free to leave. That voluntaristic culture, I say, you could see in a very strong form in the history, 19th century, 20th century rural Midwest. Now, so much for history. When I was asked to give this talk, I was asked to also talk a little bit about the future, what's happening now. I'll talk a little bit about that. I find it a little presumptuous for me to fly in from California and tell you about things that you know far better than I do about the rural Midwest. So take these as sort of comments from a distance, but maybe they're of interest. The background, of course, is that there is a nationwide increasing economic insecurity, that over the last 3 decades and accelerating, Americans have experienced more and more economic insecurity, and there are all sorts of possible consequences, which I won't talk about right now. Also, as a preliminary comment, the idea of a rural crisis, well, it was hard for me to find any period in American history in which people weren't talking about the rural crisis. Because almost from the beginning of American history as a nation, people were leaving the farms, and everybody was worrying about why people were leaving the farms. As I mentioned, in the early 1900s, there was a series of studies on the country problem in America. Investigations of particularly, for example, the crisis in the rural churches in America, rural America. And a couple decades later, the Depression certainly hit rural America very hard. Lisa Osane, who's at the Iowa Study Center in Des Moines, has described the atmosphere of desperation that hit Iowa during the Depression. Wave of bank robberies, violent bank robberies, surge in bootlegging, robberies of isolated farmhouses, domestic violence, a sharp rise in suicides, all largely attributable to the financial problems. Now, things are far better now than they were then, but there are still issues. And here's what I can see. Again, I apologize, what I see from a distance. And maybe in the Q&A I'll be corrected. One, I think, striking fact is that American farmers have been so successful as to basically put themselves out of business. That is, for generations, improved agricultural productivity has made many farm workers and farm youth redundant. And that has meant, as everybody knows, a shrinking farm population. Farm population has been shrinking throughout the United States for 150 or more years. Some estimates put farm residents now at 1 to 2% of the population. I looked it up. It's about 6% in Iowa, if my numbers are right. But even that percentage, even that number is an overestimate. A new study reported that of 2 million officially designated farms in America, only about 30%, quote, have any significant farm production, end quote. The consolidation of production continues. And this means at least two things. One is the continuing drop in real farm and village population, and the things that go along with the drop in that population. Closing of schools, for example, closing of churches. And again, this is a recurrent theme. There was a very interesting series of studies done by anthropologists of rural America in the 1940s. And then 40 years later, other anthropologists went back to a number of these towns. There may have been one in Iowa, I don't remember exactly, but these are rural, huh?
Irwin, Iowa.
Irwin, Iowa, you're right, that was one of them. Thank you. And the anthropologists came back 40 years later, and they said the same thing that the ones in the 1940s said. The town is shrinking, people are leaving, there's a problem of keeping our institutions going. So maybe even now, 40 years after that, we could tell the same story. And there's the continuing concern that's been going on forever about the outflow of the young and the better educated among rural Americans. It is striking, I'll say as a footnote to this point about the shrinking population, it is striking, speaking from California, how despite these losses, farm America maintains a political clout that its numbers would seem not to suggest, and also a cultural clout in public image. One thing I do see about farms in places like Berkeley is farmers' markets, which I think of as largely being city folks' attendance at the church of the original virtue. You get the same sort of, spiritual uplift by, buying organic zucchinis as you might by going to church. Rural sociologist Dan Lichter calls rural America, quote, our cultural deposit box, end quote. Okay, so that's one issue. Clearly, there's the persistent issue of population decline. The second one is population change and accompanying lifestyle changes. So some parts of rural America are dealing with the influx of high-income residents. This, by the way, has been remarked on for a long time. There was a study done back in the 1920s of a village in New Hampshire or Vermont, I can't remember which, complaining about these Harvard professors who were buying second homes there and changing the culture of the town. But the issues continue today. This sometimes what's called the gentrification of rural America. And there's been an interesting researcher, sociologist by the name of Brown Saraceno, who talks about a lot of these newcomers as quote-unquote social preservationists who are interested in keeping rural places preserved in amber, even though the local people might want to change them. But the reason why these city folks moved out there was they wanted whatever their image was of rural life to be preserved. And so that's one kind of flow. The other kind of flow, of course, is the multicultural flow, particularly of Latinos into all parts of rural America. I don't know how pervasive it is in Iowa, but certainly places like North Carolina and much of the South. And this has become an increasing part of rural life and something sociologists are trying to get their hand on. Third social change, technology. We're all facing questions about what the new technology will bring. In the dinner before the talk among the faculty, we're all worrying about whether online education is going to put us all out of business. Similarly, we can think about the kinds of technologies that can affect rural life, extracting more food from less land, or even making food without any land at all. I don't know what the implications are of that, but that's clearly something to keep an eye on. And then there are all the communications technologies. I've talked about the early version of this sort of communication revolution, the telephone, the car, and how it was enthusiastically welcomed in rural America. And then came radio and television, and now comes the internet. What's going to happen? Now, one promise of such technologies is that it's going to set everybody free from place and space. Now you can work anywhere, you can live anywhere, which means all those people who always wanted to live in rural areas can just pack up their laptop and move to rural America. Maybe. I'll point out one thing. In 1893, a journalist wrote a story about the telephone in which he predicted that by 1993, everybody would be living on their own mountaintop and commuting to work by telephone. So maybe finally it will happen. I don't know. But we have to think about that. And the fourth issue I would raise is the issue of the relationship to government. Now, this is a recurring tension, especially in rural America. The self-reliance theme in American culture is strongly held in rural America. And it ties in with the traditional American anti-state attitudes. It ties in, of course, with this voluntaristic culture I've mentioned. And it has meant a lot of resistance and hostility to government, particularly in the 20th century. And yet, history has shown how critical the role of government, particularly of the federal government, has been in the startup, development, and the maintenance and the success of farming. You can just quickly list everything from homestead grants, railroad grants, protection against Indians, the agricultural extension system, price regulations, price supports, Social Security for the elderly population, so that retired farmers are on Social Security. But yet this creates a tension and ambivalence in much of rural America. And we can see that in the Depression experience. There were all these New Deal initiatives that were critical in sustaining and aiding farmers to survive through the Depression. And yet there was recurrent hostility precisely to the government. And a couple of very interesting studies done of the sort of grandchildren, the children and grandchildren of the Depression era. The researchers remark on the sort of amnesia about the role of the government in saving their grandparents' farm back in the Depression. So looking ahead to the growing insecurity that all of Americans are starting to share, that's another issue, is how will rural America resolve its both dependence and its sort of cultural distaste for, its dependence on, but cultural distaste for the national government. We'll see. I mean, these are just some ideas about sort of the current issues. Let me now wrap up. I've thrown out a lot of points here, just a couple of general things. For generations then, the rural Midwest has been a key part of the emergence of what made American culture distinctive, this voluntaristic society of individual choice combined with community. Things now are in a great flux. How much of this tradition in the current sort of economic crises and economic security, how much of this tradition can continue, we don't know. As far as the rural Midwest itself, the very undergirding of the economy of this region is in flux. This agenda will let us understand what is happening in this new age of economic insecurity, particularly for rural Americans, would have been the agenda of George Beal. It is now the agenda of George Beal's descendants in places like Iowa State. Thank you very much.